to Vampire Reviews. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and I am in the mood for love and blood. Love. Mostly blood. Tonight, let's talk about love. Vampire love. With a look at the yaoi manga Vampire Portrait. The grand Japanese tradition of yaoi has spun gay romance out of just about every genre and story situation since it became mainstream a couple decades ago. But homoeroticism among vampires is hardly anything new. Now, I'm not talking tonight about the lesbian vampire trope that goes all the way back to Gothic roots. Yaoi focuses on romance between male characters only. And though the Gothic classics largely had male vampires preying on innocent young maidens, in modern times, vampires have developed a bit of a reputation for being gay. Vampire Portrait certainly wasn't the first vampire yaoi, and it's probably not the best in terms of literary merit, but it did have the fortune of being translated to English and released in America just as the Twilight craze was booming. Like with many preconceived vampire properties, the popularity of Twilight gave this manga a boost in sales and exposure it never would have gotten otherwise. At the end of the 2000s, vampires were the hot, in thing, but the vampire they had to thank for that was very different from many people's notion of what a vampire should be. He was sensitive, he was effeminate, he was so pretty, and girls loved him. As with many things women love, this led to pushback from those who may have felt masculinity was threatened by it. Edward's not a real vampire, they'd say, and among the more vocal of his haters, he's been often slurred as gay. But Twilight wasn't made for the masculine. Like most romance, and like yaoi, it was made for straight women. Edward wasn't the first sensitive vampire to have gay thrown at him as a slur. Even the classic vampires get derided that way sometimes when compared to the more animalistic monsters. As the most human and complex of monsters, vampires are declared sissies, pretty boys among the more horrifying killers, no matter how much no homo they push. Though I do have it on gay authority that despite Twilight's many inarguable flaws, Edward's role as an emotional abuser, Edward as a character was, in a sense, empowering as a representation of non-traditionally masculine men in how a physically powerful and sexually desirable male character is portrayed in media. Yes, the way he treats Bella is domineering in a frightening way that no relationship situation should aspire to, but that aspect of him is at odds with the soft side these haters disliked. They wanted their men to be men and their vampires to be heartless, unrepentant, man-eating monsters. And Edward successfully challenged that. It's kind of ironic that gay was a slur they used, considering that in terms of romantic and sexual preference, he is one of the straightest straight vampires out there in a very Christian, authorial, intense sort of way. But he was far from the first sensitive vampire, and some of the most noteworthy examples you can name actually are queer. In her genre-shaping vampire chronicles, Anne Rice created a whole universe of male characters who are essentially pan and often poly. Once they become vampires, they are no longer sexual creatures, and so they develop both bloodlust attractions to any gender who happens to have blood, and deep emotional connections to any gender who happens to have emotions. It's a pretty awesome take. When sex as a reproductive concept is removed from a creature's biology and replaced with something as universal as blood, gender blindness, queerness becomes default. So, operating under the philosophy that a vampire is inclined to be queer by its very nature, you could say that vampire yaoi makes more sense than many other yaoi situations. A lot of yaoi takes place in a sort of fantasy universe where gayness is just accepted as the norm and concern over its stigma is never addressed. Often it seems like women don't even exist in these worlds. And as this art form is created as a fantasy for women and not men, the people it's depicting, this can be genuinely problematic. There are gay men who love yaoi and others who are deeply offended by it. But though I'm not here to pass any judgment on the art form or its audience, I do think many of the issues that could be offensive are minimized with the inclusion of vampires. In Vampire Portrait, a vampire named Sane hires a human named Lou to paint his portrait. Lou quickly falls in love with Sane, though learns Sane's in a contract relationship with the human Adam. Now this is an interesting take on the cliché love triangle. Usually it's the uke protagonist who's the center of the love triangle. This is part of the appeal of something like Twilight, two sexy guys fighting for the audience insert's affection. And for a gay alternative to Twilight, that may have appeal to gay male persons during an era when women were going crazy over vampires. It would have been exciting to imagine oneself in Lou's shoes. But though Adam acts titillatingly stalkery with Lou, it's Sane who they are fighting over. The larger plot is that Sane's villainous vampire brother Valoran, now there's a vampire name for you, wants to die, and only another vampire can kill him. He wants to drive Sane to do it, but this won't be easy because first of all, Sane doesn't want to, and second of all, Valoran's vampire nature makes him fight back and resist death despite how he wants it. There's an epic final battle in a trippy dream dimension, and in the end, the lovers win and the rivals learn to deal with sharing Sane's attention. Though Sane is now over Adam and into Lou, I'm sure their Facebook status merely changed to "it's complicated," cause it's hinted in ways that shows sure seeds for fanfickers that the romantic threads will be perpetually entangled. Unlike much yaoi, there's not really any sex in this manga. The furthest it goes is Sane's mouth on Lou when Sane is possessed by his evil brother, so it's not even really him doing it. So it falls in the shonen ai subcategory. But though sex is often associated with vampires, I think it's particularly apt that there is none here. At the beginning of the story, Sane tells Lou that though he drank Lou's blood, Lou won't become a vampire unless he receives Sane's bodily fluids. Lou infers this to mean sex, though Valoran also suggests blood's an option. As Sane has been drinking Adam's blood for years and he's still human, we can infer they've never had sex either, despite the love between them being pointedly romantic. And by the end, Lou has no intention of becoming a vampire, so it's implied that his relationship with Sane will be restricted to cuddling, making out, and blood drinking. But such a sexless relationship is not strange. There's actually a very high percentage of asexual readers among the yaoi fanbase, and that makes sense. For women who are so used to reading stories where women are depicted as sexual objects, especially in vampire fiction, the male-male relationships of yaoi eliminates that aspect. And these women are free to indulge in the complex, angsty, fun feelings of romance in a way that makes them feel safe and protected from sexual victimization, even if the male characters are not. In many takes on vampire lore, bloodlust completely replaces sexual lust, and thus results in an inherent asexuality to the vampire as a creature, even as it serves as a sexual metaphor. And that's the point of a metaphor, isn't it? One thing representing another. Actual sex can't be a metaphor for sex. But though the metaphor was considered a cautionary tale in the Victorian era, it's pretty cool to see that the modern era has sort of reclaimed it, and the asexuality has become literal and romantic for some vampires. How often do we get to see this with other character and story tropes? Of course, the other side to this is the question of the consequences of stripping homoeroticism of sex to the effect of making it palatable to a straight audience. The impact that has on the effort to normalize gay intercourse in our culture. The vampire asexuality connection presents some mixed bag that can be impacted different ways, for better or for worse, but it's not like there aren't plenty of other vampires that do enjoy good old-fashioned human-style sex. There has been a huge market for completely literal, non-metaphorical vampire erotica, straight, gay, and everything beyond. But then with these stories, the vampire is often reduced to a fetish, and I think loses much of its literary symbolism. Without the metaphor, a romantic vampire is at best a sort of tormented superhero type.
Now I've freezing hands and bloodless veins.
Aside from sex, or should I say in addition to it, because aren't they always connected, we get a fair helping of religion in Vampire Portrait. Christianity and vampires go way back to the ancient European folklore, and every twist in the book has been played on the symbolism and metaphors of it. Vampire Portrait has crosses, churches, disillusioned medieval warlords, Bible references, and so forth, but the story, and even the magic spells that underlay the rules of the universe, seem to have nothing at all to do with God himself. It's a story about love of men, brotherly love, platonic love, mentor love, romantic love, and though themes of love run rampant in Christianity, none of that is connected to the characters here. Adam even asks Sane what's up with his religiousness, and neither Sane nor the manga provide an answer. The central theme is that of self-love, of cherishing personal identity as emphasized by Sane's wish not to kill his brother. He's never killed anyone via blood drinking before and therefore hasn't absorbed anyone else's identity. His drive is to remain true to himself, and he never connects that to God or faith or forgiveness or any of those other tropes. As for Lu, he worships Sane in an idolizing romance way, and at the beginning of the story he's inspired to make a personal god of Sane, even though he doesn't seem to be generally pious. It's just the concept of a god that appeals to Lu, a supreme ideal. This is technically rather blasphemous, but it's one of the looser story threads and gets dropped pretty early without tying back into the ending as Sane's priority of identity takes over. It feels like the author only thought to include all the Christianity nods because it's an expected vampire trope, but no conclusion is ever provided to any of it. But perhaps this is for the best, because the common conclusion usually revolves around damnation, and that could negatively reflect on the homosexuality aspect here. Just a bit. But the result is that, unlike some of the other more thought-out aspects of this little story, all the Jesus stuff is left shallow and unresolved. And it is a little story. It's only 2 volumes, which is short in terms of manga, especially for a genre where romance takes up so much of the page time. Though the 2 vampires we see have created a sort of legacy empire with Adam's grand family, it's done in a very tiny corner of their world. It's an intimate story that exists in a sheltered bubble. We have one good vampire versus one bad vampire locked in an entirely personal struggle with no stakes larger than their lives and the happiness of Sane's 2 boyfriends. It's not even so much a matter of protecting potential future victims from their vampire nature. Though Valoran kills people, Sane never has since his warlord days. This is the main reason why the romance between him and the good-hearted Lu is believable. Sane just drinks a little bit of blood from his contracted mortal lover every now and then, and he's good to go. In fact, it seems Sane's existence as a vampire doesn't have very many drawbacks at all, other than not being able to see his reflection. Adam's contract gives him complete control over Sane, and he could, in theory, unleash him as a monster upon the world, but he would never do that. The issue you run into with a good, moral, softened, romantic, sensitive character like this who can get away with not ever having to do anything bad is, what's the point of him even being a vampire at all? We get the usual vampire points checked off with his evil brother, but isn't it wasted on Sane? Well, the author makes it worth it when Sane gets possessed. He gets a moment to be truly scary, and we see the potential of how monstrous he could be if he chose to. And knowing he could be forced to be terrible against his will provides enough source of angst to motivate his desperate need to retain his identity. The reason he needs Lu to paint his portrait in the first place is so he can see what he looks like and cling to that image if he ever starts to lose it. And this is a pretty universal conflict. Most people in the world know they would never do anything villainous, but really, we're all capable of it, and what if? The effort to be a moral individual is a daily choice we all make. Valoran, on the other hand, has reached his limit with himself. He wants to end his life because he has no self-control. Even though he's depicted as a cliché sort of cackling one-liner spouting join the dark side villain, the fact that he doesn't want to be adds a nice layer to him. Unlike Sane, he can't connect to people and feels separated from the world. And this makes him pitiable. At the end of the manga, it's implied that Adam's older brother was in a contract with Valoran, and he is grateful Valoran's finally been set free. To see that there was someone else who loved him and was probably loved by him in spite of his ways also adds another level of insight to his struggle. Valoran doesn't possess Sane because he wants him to rape Lu for the sake of villainy, but because he hopes Lu will become a vampire and offer him another option to achieve his assisted suicide. The possession angle brings in the closest the manga gets to a sex scene when Sane is forced to attack Lu. Fetishizing rape is common in yaoi, often ending with the victim feeling attraction for the aggressor, but Vampire Portrait subverts this trope in an interesting way. Neither of the characters are into it at all. Lu knows Sane's being controlled, so even though it's drawn in a way that seems like the author was thinking, well, I gotta give the reader something, I guess, it's done with still so much implication that it's not supposed to be erotic. Lu seriously does not want it. His worry for Sane and disappointment in the falseness of the circumstances override arousal. Lu is too mature and emotionally healthy for this to get to him. And as for Sane, in order to stop the assault, he injures himself. It's clear that the whole thing is bad. It is harm. It's not done to kink shame though, just to make it clear that eroticism doesn't apply here. The scene ends with gentle cuddling, and the most they ever do after this is hold hands. Kind of a bait and switch for a manga with this on the cover, but that didn't seem to hurt its measure of success. It's implied they'll live happily ever after in this sexless relationship, at least until Lou grows old and dies. But this works because Sane is good, and doesn't do anything Lou's morality would object to, including not wanting to inflict the curse of the vampire upon someone he loves. That, and it's been established he's capable of moving on from one mortal lover to the next. And everyone accepts that. This isn't your typical cliche love story for the ages of eternal bond, but simply a supernatural romance fantasy adventure. And that's kind of nice for a change, isn't it? To see a more realistic reflection of the temporal nature of romance? Realistic, while also still connecting vampire nature back to the intricacies of its metaphorical depths. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and don't worry, we'll talk about lesbian vampires soon. So, Vampire Portrait is probably something I never would have discovered if it hadn't been specially requested by one of my Patreon patrons. There is so much vampire media and pop culture out there, and I am but a humble scholar, learning and growing with each bite. Every now and then, I open special reward levels on my Patreon where you, yes you, can also request I make a video about the vampire item of your choice. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, here's the address. No amount is too big or too small, and thank you so much to everyone who's supported me so far already. I could not do this show without you. If Patreon is out of your means, you could still make my night by liking this video, leaving a comment, subscribe to my channel. The night is ours to share.